Hey guys, what's up? My name's Justine. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to show you how to pull a pattern from an existing garment. So for me, I'm going to use this jacket that I really like and I want to recreate. So I'm going to show you how to basically trace the garment and pull all of the pieces that you would need to make it into another jacket. And then in a separate video, I'm going to show you how to assemble it all together so you can recreate your own clothing. So let's get started. So I'm going to be using this jacket for this video, so the first thing I did was found a workspace that's big enough for me to lay it out flat. Once you have your workspace set up, you want to grab something soft to lay underneath your garment. I used a roll of oversized tracing paper for this project, which I'll link in the description. Then you're going to grab some pins. Regular ones will work just fine, but I'm going to use some bigger ones just so you can see better. Once I had my space set up, I grabbed my jacket and laid it out as flat as I could. I'm starting with the back because that's the easiest part. So basically the plan is to kind of trace the jacket by poking holes into the tracing paper around where the seams are. So I'm just going to start with an easy one on that flat seam and then work my way around the curve on the bottom. Kind of just worked my way around the jacket until I got to the curve of the shoulder seam, and then I switched to a smaller pin and worked right along that curve by poking right through the fabric. When I was done with that, I did the same thing on the other shoulder seam as well as the neckline. So basically you're going to end up with a bunch of dots that kind of map out the shape of the entire back panel of the jacket. I know you can barely see this, so I just went over them so you can maybe see a little bit better. Once we have the shape mapped out with our pinholes, we're going to take a quilter square and trace over those lines. The straight lines are super easy, but I have this curve at the bottom of my jacket. I'm basically going to reflect it later. You can see it's a little uneven, but I'll show you how to fix that later. I continued to trace, knowing that some of the dots aren't going to line up perfectly, but that's okay. You can kind of adjust as you go. They're just meant as a guideline. When I looked closer at my jacket, the top shoulder seam doesn't actually fall on the top of the shoulder. It falls a little bit forward. So I knew I needed to add extra fabric to the back panel. So I just measured how much that piece folds over the front of the shoulder and added it to the back. It was only about an inch, so I just used my quilter square to add that. When you're pulling a pattern, you kind of want to think about, like, if I were to take this garment apart at the seams, what would all those individual pieces look like flat? Once I had it all traced out, you can kind of see that the curve does not match on the bottom, and I do want it to. So I ended up folding my tracing paper in half and just kind of copying the curve that I did like in a different color so that I could redraw the one on the other side. I ended up going in and kind of tweaking the shoulder seams as well, just so they were all even. That's the beauty of working with tracing paper on this project. I was happy to have an oversized roll on hand. I will link that in the description below. Sometimes when I make mistakes like this, I'll end up throwing a little piece of masking tape over the lines I don't want to use anymore. Just in case I put this project down and don't come back to it till later, it's kind of like a little mental note for myself. Speaking of notes, I am just going to add a little label on the back, and then we're going to add our seam allowance. So I'm going to add my seam allowance. I'm using a different color so you can see, but I actually would not recommend using a magic marker because it sticks to the side of the ruler. I am going to go with a seam allowance of 1 inch on this project, so I'm going to take that 1 inch line right there on my quilter square and line it up with the black pattern line. When you get to the curves, I kind of like to do a dotted pattern by lining 1 inch up along the black line and just dot along the edge of the ruler until I have enough dots to kind of connect them and make a line. And since this piece is symmetrical on both sides, I'm going to save a little time and just trace the one half that I already have done. So a typical seam allowance is usually going to be around 1/4 inch, especially if you're working with flat woven fabrics, but I'm not sure what I'm going to be making this out of. It's probably going to be something a little thicker, and I always think it's better to have more than you need because you can always trim off later. Okay, so now we're kind of getting the hang of it, so let's move on to the front. Since there are two panels and they are symmetrical, I'm just going to trace one and then flip it over and trace the reverse for the second panel. So I'm going to grab my pins and I'm going to start with the curve of the collar first. Then I'm going to open the jacket up so I can lay it flat, and we're going to do the same thing that we did before. This jacket has a detail along the button part, but rather than trace that out, I'm just going to make a little mental note for later. Okay, and just like we did before, I'm going to connect all the dots using my marker, and then we'll go around and add our seam allowance. And as usual, I'm just going to label this so I remember which panel it is, and then I'm going to go in and measure the detail of that little stripe down the button line, and I'm going to add that into my pattern just so I remember it when I go to make my jacket. Since both front panels are the same shape, but just the reverse of each other, I'm going to flip this piece over, grab a fresh piece of tracing paper, and just go ahead and trace the reverse image. That way I end up with both panels that are the same shape. And once I have both of those traced, since we're using tracing paper, you can kind of lay them on top of each other, and that strip where the buttons fall should actually overlap, because when you wear the jacket, it'll actually be buttoned together. So this one looks pretty good. So now that I have the big pieces done, I'm going to move on to the sleeve. So if you take a look, you'll see that the seam is kind of on the bottom of this sleeve, kind of coming out of the armpit. And then there's this additional seam down the back of the arm that's going to allow us to put our buttons in. Right now I'm sort of trying to visualize if I were to take all of these seams out, what would these pieces of fabric look like flat? To make it easy on myself, I'm going to start with the front, and then I'll flip it over and tackle the back, because that's a little more complicated. So the top fold of the sleeve is where we're going to flip it so we can start the back. So I just put a couple dots to remind me where to line up the top of the sleeve once we flip it over. So if you're working with a garment that doesn't have these buttons, you can totally skip this step and just trace the entire outline of the backside of the sleeve. But because mine has the buttons, I have this extra panel. So I'm going to grab my pins and poke my holes right down that seam, and then I'll show you how to add a little extra fabric for the buttons. So it looks like this slit for the buttons goes about 4 inches up, so I measured that on my quilter square. Then I just kind of eyeballed the inside measurement, and I added 2 inches of extra fabric, so when I cut, I have enough seam allowance to turn that under and install my buttons. And then I had the second panel of this sleeve, and it's basically the same concept. I'm just going to trace the outline using my pins, and then I'm going to add that same little pop out so that both sleeves have enough space to install the buttons. And And then by this point, you probably already know the drill. I'm going to go ahead and add 1 inch of seam allowance around the whole thing. And you could probably see this coming, but the right sleeve is going to be the same exact shape as the left sleeve. So I'm going to do what I did before by flipping this over so we can get the reverse image, laying out more tracing paper, and tracing out the right sleeve. So if you're still with me, we have all the large pieces of the jacket traced, and we pretty much just have the details left, meaning the collar and the pockets. And the collar is pretty much just a trapezoid. It's a straight shape, so rather than poke holes along the whole edge, I'm just poking pinholes at each corner, and then I'll connect the dots with my ruler. And then of course I'm going to add my 1 inch of seam allowance. I also have this little detail piece that falls right under the collar. Instead of actually tracing that out, I'm just going to take the measurement of the collar and draw it out to size. As you can see, these curves don't totally match up, but if we use the trick we did before, by folding this piece of paper in half, I could have got the same curve on both sides. But, you know, it's a work in progress. So I pretty much just have the pockets left, and I actually don't love the pockets on this jacket. I don't really like the pleat. And the beauty of tracing out your own pattern is you can make any modifications that you want. So I'm going to kind of skip that step, and I'm just going to take the measurement of the pocket and basically just draw a rectangle the same size. And then of course I added my 1 inch of seam allowance. I'm not sure I would make a pocket flap if I were going to make this jacket again, but I figured why not make a pattern piece, so I basically just drew a rectangle and widened it by about 1/2 inch so that if I were to make a pocket, the flap would be wider and cover the pocket by a little bit. And that's it, that's all the pieces we needed. So I just went around and cut on that red line so that when I go to make the jacket, I have all the pieces prepped and ready to go. Once I had them all cut out, I did want to just kind of show you how they're all going to fit together. So I laid them out as if they were pieces of fabric of the jacket, and you can kind of see the jacket beginning to take shape. And now you know how to pull a pattern from an existing garment that you already love so you can recreate it. I am going to be doing a separate video where I use these pattern pieces to recreate this jacket from a vintage blanket. So I'm going to go ahead and link that right here as well as in the description below. So be sure to check that out. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. If you like this video and you want to see more, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.